Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see at least names, if some faces as well. This is the fun new reality of figuring out Zoom in the process of doing everything else. It usually works pretty well, and I'm glad to be able to join you from a distance, even though it is 8 o'clock here. I mean,
That's right.
but I guess in church work Sunday morning, there's no sleeping in anyways. Um, so I am director of spiritual formation. I'm also co-coordinator for discipleship ministries, which some of you might have known earlier on in other iterations used to be called parish ministries, was called congregational life teams at some point, and then it was congregational life ministries. Um, we've shifted in the last several years to calling discipleship ministries, particularly because of our focus. Being very clear about what we wanted our focus to be, that it's not just about congregations, since of course, we plan a number of the events around denominational life, including National Youth Conference, Young Adult Conference, and Older Adult Conference. So recognizing that we don't just serve or minister in the congregational context, but that we have an event-based ministry as well. I'm glad to be a part of a team of 4 directors. It's myself and Stan Dewick, who doesn't live too far from many of you. Stan is the director of organizational leadership. Becky Ullum-Nagel, who's director of youth and young adult ministries. And we just are super excited to have added LaDonna Sanders and Kosi as our director of intercultural ministries. LaDonna is a church planter. She's working in cross-cultural ministries in a variety of ways. She's currently working on a doctorate of ministry, looking at American congregations intersecting and building relationships internationally, especially in South Africa. So we just have a great team of folks that handle a lot of things that you probably touch in various points, whether that's events or resources we've created. In some cases, you might run into folks doing deacon workshops. There's a whole range of things that we're a part of, and we're grateful for that work that we're able to do. And we're grateful for platforms like this that we can do, even though we're not traveling. As you might have heard, a lot of our staff, we've actually directed them that we're not traveling, even nationally right now. And so all of our work for all of us is from our homes, at our desks, some of us in our basements like this, just kind of makeshift work. All of our staff, except for IT and finance, are doing that. And we have a few folks that, like I said, working on computers and servers and getting the checks processed and stuff, still have to work from the office buildings in New Windsor and Elgin. And so we continue to pray for them as they travel back and forth, hoping that they'll maintain good health as everything's going on. But we're grateful for them as well. I wanted to talk a bit about, some of you probably know the compelling vision that has come out in the last several months. I think we saw the first drafts of that, or the first full thing, in January, that talks about Jesus in the neighborhood as a part of the vision for the church going forward. I'm really excited about that. I mean, I'm a little apprehensive, partly because discipleship is named so clearly in the compelling vision. But I'm excited for that because it also reflects some directions that we've been headed in the last 4 years. I'm going to flip to a presentation, and hopefully it'll work for everyone. So we'll see if Zoom cooperates, at least on this front. Just simply called The Church in the Neighborhood, which is a presentation that I've done in several settings, including annual conference last year with a good friend of mine, Jose Humphreys, that was there speaking with us. Jose is in East Harlem, where he is a church planter. All right. All right, so just give me a heads up that you all can see that. Good? Jason, look good?
Yep, looks great.
Awesome, thank you. About 4 years ago, Jeff Carter had invited discipleship ministries and the Church of the Brethren into a partnership to look at a urban ministry in Atlanta that he had encountered through a friendship, a golfing friendship actually, but hey, we won't say how he gets there. And we've worked hard at looking at what it means for the church to be a part of the development of its own neighborhood and its community. And so I want to start with Jeremiah 29 that some of you probably know fairly well. That in there, the letters handed to the people in exile, and basically the letter, now that I think about it, that letter seems a little striking for a time in quarantine, right? Plant gardens, strengthen your houses, marry, settle down, you're going to be there a while. But it's interesting that it says in there, promote the welfare of the city. Some of you might have heard promote the peace of the city, depending on the translation. And then in that is that concept of shalom, right? That it's the welfare of the people around you, the good economic, the prosperity of the people you are with, is also your prosperity, right? And so just thinking about that as a way of framing community ministry in which we seek the welfare of the city. We're not just looking for people to be filling our seats. I mean, I use the language of butts, budgets, and bylaws, right? Like those things that we want butts in the pew and we want increased budgets. No, what it's saying is prepare and minister outwardly, minister to the community, make sure that everyone has what they need, because when they have prosperity and flourish and have peace, you as a people, the people of God, will have that same experience. I'm going to show you this quick video and hopefully the sound comes through. We'll try it first. This is Bruce Deal.
We didn't set out to start City of Refuge. Our life's purpose, we didn't think, was to create this nonprofit environment, but it sort of happened. I was invited to help oversee the closing of a little church a couple miles from our current location. And at this little church, about 20 folks gathered for worship experience that morning. And after service had begun, a young lady walked in, and at the end of the service, she walked down to me with tears streaming down her face. And she just simply said, I've been hooking and stripping 14 years. I want to come out of the lifestyle. Can you help me? And so we provided some resources for Carolyn that week and stayed in relationship with her, and she continued to show up. And a couple weeks later, 2 more people in crisis walked in, and a couple weeks later, 6 more people in crisis walked in. And about 4 months into that experience, we walked in, and on a Sunday morning, there were nearly 100 drug addicts, alcoholics, prostitutes, people running from jail, homeless individuals, and they simply asked one question of me and of Rhonda, and they said, can you help us? We ended up moving in the 3rd floor of this 65-year-old church building. My kids took a bath in a number 2 wash tub that we would fill up with a water hose. In those 6 years, we were broken into 34 times and multiple vehicles stolen. In the middle of all of that, life just sort of got better for Rhonda and the girls and I. We suddenly were at this place of enjoying what we did more than we ever had. We now have a space where about 250 homeless women and children wake up on campus every day in a safe, clean, warm environment. They get high-quality meal service. They have child care provided for them, medical, mental health, dental, and vision, vocational training, employment identification, housing identification when they graduate. We have partners on campus with Feed My Lambs Child Care and Bright Futures Academy and Mercy Care Medical Clinic that provide those necessary life resources. We created the 180-degree culinary arts training program and the Napa Auto Skills training program to help men and women walk the journey to self-sufficiency and to employment. And the dream that we have is to take this model and to place it in cities all over the country and in other countries as well. We're now in about 18 different locations through our affiliate program, from California to Ohio to Tennessee to Virginia to Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and Guatemala. And our next big endeavor is 150 acres directly around City of Refuge. The 30314 zip code has historically had the highest crime rate in the state of Georgia, highest homeless population per capita, highest number of HIV positive cases, more men and women incarcerated from our zip code than any zip code in the state of Georgia. It's a tough place, but it's a tough place with a lot of promise. It's a tough place with a lot of potential. We believe that we can bring businesses to our neighborhood, We believe we can create more employment training opportunities with home renovation training and with landscape training and security patrol training. We believe that individuals in our neighborhood who are currently unemployed and maybe unemployable can go through our training programs, help revitalize our neighborhood, and then become productive citizens in the neighborhood that they help to bring restoration to. We're transforming thousands of lives inside of that community. And we believe when a child now is born into our neighborhood, they can attain and achieve middle class by middle age because every resource they needed has been provided. It's a journey that's a long journey. It's a tough journey. It has a lot of twists and turns to it, but it's a journey that we know we can reach the end of because of relationships with folks like you and others that you'll introduce City of Refuge to along your way.
For 2 years now, Bethany and Discipleship Ministries have co-taught a class at City of Refuge where we're doing an immersion experience. We stay on campus there at City. We sit with the residents that live there in their long-term development ministry. We meet in their classroom space in their technology hub. We basically live there. We live on the bluff, which, as you heard Bruce say, has the highest crime rate in all of Georgia, not just Atlanta, right, which is a huge place. It's all of Georgia. And we've been privileged to see in that course, we've seen build a number of relationships with both residents and staff. Several of the staff there have come through the program, have come out of the gang lifestyle. Some of them have come out of the sex trafficking industry and are now working and part of the community and embedded there on the bluff, which is this neighborhood where the City of Refuge is. We've taken about 15 students there now in the course, both with the training through the Trim Academy, as well as through master's level students, to explore what it looks like for the church to be embedded in its community today. Through this partnership, we've encountered a number of other resources and connections, especially the group called the Christian Community Development Association. So the Church of the Brethren is now the first denominational member for Christian Community Development Association. CCDA started in a similar way to City of Refuge. Man here in Chicago on the west side, Wayne Gordon, we affectionately call him Coach, partnered with John Perkins, who came from Mississippi and had a lifetime of advocacy and activism in terms of race relations, but also in community leadership and development. Coach and Mr. Perkins worked together to develop CCDA that connected the number of ministries around the country that are doing development style work, right? Working at economic development, taking and partnering with local leaders to build assets, to take the leadership, identify needs, and follow them into the ministries, into their communities. CCDA is a wonderful resource for us because it's beginning to connect us both in terms of training, but also in terms of envisioning what it looks like for the church to move beyond just response and service, but to be embedded in their communities to do development, right? So that those communities grow in their capacities, that their people are finding employment, they're finding dignity in their work, and that they're finding support and cross-cultural, cross-racial relationships. So we're excited about this whole framework that we're taking part in to begin to expand what it means to find Jesus in the neighborhood, just like the compelling vision points us to. Not necessarily that we are bringing Jesus to the neighborhood, but we're going there and we're meeting Jesus in what Jesus is already doing, and assisting and taking part in that as it grows and develops, as the community leaders around us identify the needs and direct the resource application. I'm just curious if any of you all, that's a lot. if any of you all have questions or just observations even about Bruce's video.
I had a quick question or comment. You just mentioned about how there's a distinction between, feeling like you are bringing Jesus to the neighborhood, as opposed to kind of identifying where that process is already moving. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the distinction between a church kind of creating a whole bunch of programs or a whole bunch of programming, or as opposed to partnering with local groups that have already done that or organizations that have done that. How do you see that distinction between kind of doing it yourself or influencing others or partnering?
The, there's a conversation, at least in theological circles, about the missional church, right? And there was this idea that missional meant you got outside of your building and you took Jesus to the places that were hurting and in need. What a lot of folks are reminding us, though, is that God was already in those places doing things, that it didn't need necessarily the white affluent communities to come in and do those things for others. So if we could shift our perspective to think about how are we partnering with and connecting with the folks that are doing that. What's interesting about, if we use City of Refuge as a good example, City of Refuge started by someone in the community identifying the need. As Bruce said, she came to the church and said, I need to get out of the lifestyle. Can you help me? She had already identified the need. Something was already transforming there for her. And there was a capacity in Bruce and Rhonda to be able to respond to that and do specific and targeted things there. One of the other things that Bruce has helped us to see is a concept called collective impact, right? So Bruce and his family and the congregation, the mission church, did one thing, right? And that was primarily focused on women and children. But they built all of these relationships with other groups in the community who were doing things, right? So Bright Futures as a child, a teaching charter school, Feed My Lambs, as well as, which is a Catholic nurse healthcare agency, right, for low-income people. And they were able to partner together to bring their specific skills and their specific missions to amplify the work that each of them was doing, right? So if you think about that as, there's a lot of folks that are doing community development style ministries, right? It's not that the church has to come in and do them all. The church can come in and identify a need and take part in that. That's just kind of the focus that I want to bring. I think, does that get to your question a bit more, Jason, as how those either differ or complement each other? Yeah.
I think so. I just, I'm looking around and I know that there are a lot of people within this congregation who work really closely with some of the local organizations we have doing a lot of good work.
I think that makes sense for a lot of brethren, right? Generally, as I go about the denomination, you hear about a lot of church members who are active in a number of community organizations, but also a number of brethren who are teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers that have their vocational job, the work they do for a job is actually in community ministries as well, right? The thing that we often hear, especially when we're in Atlanta, I won't name the church, but you can ask me later and I'll tell you which one it is, but that we talk about the drive-by sandwiching, right? So it's a church that's outside of downtown Atlanta, and about once a month they load everybody in their cars and they have coolers and they drop in egg salad sandwiches and they drive downtown to a particular neighborhood and they just hand out sandwiches. And then everybody gets back in their cars and goes back outside what we call the perimeter in Atlanta and never really stay put, right? They actually don't build relationships. They don't actually address anything beyond a just immediate need of just one sandwich that day. That it doesn't really make much of an impact. I don't think that's the kind of ministries brethren have been engaged in, right, or are doing now, both individually and as congregations. what I do think we can start to think about is how we address or how we take part in a variety of holistic emphases, right? Not just seeing building houses or immediate long-term needs in terms of service, but necessarily thinking about maybe how is the church and its resources able to address things like economic need, economic growth, using its resources and relationships, even its buildings, to begin to foster a growing economic need. So as we think about COVID, how many of you have seen stories about farmers either there in Lancaster County or farmers in Virginia in the Valley that are having to call their herds, whether that's pigs or steers, because there's just no market for the meat. And how many of that might even affect our, Church of the Brethren farmers at this point too. But, what would happen if churches and their relationships began to take some of those, maybe buy up some of those herds? I mean, some of you have done meat canning in a variety of ministries, right? And help to process that meat and sell it or redistribute it in a way that builds the economic capacity of those farmers and also folks in your community that might be looking for jobs at that point, right? A man named Bob Lupton, who's also a part of CCDA, has written a book called Toxic Charity, and his kind of aha moment was taking Christmas gifts to a family. And he realized that as he was taking gifts to these families, that the man of the house, the husband, often disappeared out the back door when they arrived with all the presents. And the thing that he realized is that as they were coming in and just dropping things off, that they were undermining the kind of dignity of the father and sometimes even the mother to do those kind of things for their own families. And so what they did, instead of dropping it off, they took all those toys that were, donated for Christmas, and in their church building, they opened the basement and literally created a store where families could come and work and, prepare the toys, clean them up, keep them stocked up, keep the aisles, help people around, and earn money to go through and do what they called like a shopping spree, so that the money that they earned, they could buy the toys that were there for 10 or 20% of the actual cost. So that money kind of stayed cyclical within the system, but it gave people a reason to take pride in what they were offering both to their families and build relationships with their communities, right? So Lupton, or Bob, decided to take the resources of the church building, right? All of those toys that were given, even the building space, and use it differently than just kind of dropping things off in families' households, but built the dignity and the economic capacity of the people that were there. So, just those kind of imaginative ways of using the resources we have, the relationships we have in the community that grow what's going on and what's already there. Other questions that are coming up for you? Maybe it feels a bit like Fire Hose Cocktail, a little too early in the morning, right?
If anyone has any questions, I know not everyone has their microphones turned on this morning. If anyone has any questions they'd like to enter into the chat, I'd be happy to ask those as well.
Hey, Jason, Josh.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
It looks like someone else is there ahead of me.
I don't see anybody else. Go ahead.
Oh, this is not quite on the point of your immediate discussion, but just curious about how you do ministry in staying in place. I mean, how do your other staff people, how are you getting, I know you're getting work done, but practically, how is this all happening in real time and in the work that you do? Just curious.
a lot of us spend 4 to 5 hours on Zoom in a day, right? Between staff meetings, connecting. Nancy Heischman, for example, director of ministry, is meeting with the district executives every Tuesday afternoon. And that's one way of kind of collaborating around and getting connections. We're also working pretty collectively, both in Zoom to develop, how are we responding? What things do we need to coordinate? And then just getting out, right? The other thing that we're doing, Stan Dewick has a list of 8 webinars that he's got planned or in process of planning for the next 2 months. So those offerings will be coming out. And in fact, I'm pretty excited. I'm starting a podcast that's called Mathetes, which is just the Greek word for disciple, right? So it's a podcast where I'll be interviewing. I have Jose Humphreys and Dennis Edwards on my schedule to interview, and that will probably roll out in about 2 weeks. So there's a lot of stuff that we're trying to do both digitally and relationally that we're doing dislocatedly, I guess that's a bad adverb, but that's about as best as I can describe it.
Thank you.
Craig Coble, did you have a question?
I sent it in on the chat to Josh.
Oh, great. I was gonna say, I don't see it. It must have gone privately to Josh.
Yeah, sure, it went privately. So you're asking about how is Bethany related to SVMC and Trim, right?
Yeah.
Could you say some more about, I mean, I can give you the institutional relationships, but I'm not sure that's quite what you're asking.
Well, yeah, that's part of it, and just how they cooperate to achieve some of these educational goals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So of course, Trim itself as a program is a partnership between the Office of Ministry and Bethany. So there's a lot of overlap there going back and forth. In terms of SVMC, right, between the partner districts and then Bethany, that's a little more distinct, right? And Joe might be able to answer some of that a little bit better, but I think the partnership with national programs has been both intentional and informal, right? There's a lot of conversations back and forth where we say, hey, this might be a really good opportunity. And within about 6 months, we have an idea of how to put something on the ground. So this class in Atlanta is a good example. Bethany invited us to come down and see the ministry and see what we could do. And by the time we left Atlanta, we had a rough outline of a course that would kind of break some barriers in terms of having a master's level students as well as Trim Academy level students in a classroom together with 2 faculty members, myself and Dan Poole. We basically had that put together by the time we left Atlanta 2 days later. So that relationship back and forth, hanging out together, thinking through things, identifying opportunities and building a plan happens in that informal space, but that informal space happens because of those institutional relationships, right? That the Academy is that bridge place between Church of the Brethren Incorporated and Bethany. Does that get to what you were asking a bit?
That helped me understand more about Atlanta, not
Sure.
necessarily SVMC.
Yeah, I know that's a good thing. And my interaction with SVMC is so limited. I mean, my understanding is primarily bureaucratic, right? What supports it and who's doing the kind of oversight and program development.
Yes, as SVMC is certified by the Brethren Academy for Ministerial Leadership, and it's a 3-way partnership with Bethany Seminary, because SVMC does sponsor Master Divinity classes from Bethany on occasion, and also people can take Trim credit through SVMC. So it's a good partnership.
Right. And that's a good example of a partnership that is supported a lot by the districts surrounding the immediate districts around it. Right. I mean, there are district representatives to that group that help guide that.
Yeah, 5 districts support
Right.
SBMC.
Mhm.
Jason, am I unmuted?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Josh, I do have a question for you. Donna Hollinger here.
Mhm.
I really appreciate you sharing your City of Refuge video. My husband and I have often felt that Elizabethtown, we are still searching for our collective purpose. We
Mhm.
have an awful lot that we are involved in, but sometimes we feel that we might be spreading ourselves in too many directions. When you said that that one small church picked a mission of women and children and then branched out from there, that really hit something with me. And I know this is a terrible time to be talking about these things, but I think Elizabethtown has so much potential in the community, but we collectively do not work at one thing. We work on many, many different things. Can you give a little more of your perspective on that?
I think that's pretty typical across the denomination. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that is how our churches have empowered and given people the energy to connect into the communities and do the ministries that are there, right? I think that's every congregation I go to, and you sit around at the potluck for a while and you hear about the number of things that they tap into in terms of resourcing and connecting their communities. And that can be also the strength too, is that the church could begin to pull on those member relationships so that those groups are collaborating and connecting and seeing how their ministries amplify each other when they're put side by side. So one of the things about CCDA I think that's helpful is that it's also naming how persons can connect with the other development ministries in their communities, right? So as members, we give out a membership to each congregation, and Jason, we can talk about this in a little bit, but that puts you on the map literally as a member of CCDA, and those other style ministries that share that commitment that are nearby can look at that map and see what you're doing, right? That maybe one of the possibilities is also just pulling together and helping to name collective impact, right? How can we, as these disparate groups, partner in a way that amplifies all the ministries, right? It really depends on, I think, the congregational culture, the leaders that are there, so for Bruce's example, their ability to just kind of focus in on that piece was pretty easy because they were a small church with like 10, 15 people who drove into the neighborhood for worship, right? They didn't have a lot of a lot of relationships already in the neighborhood to do that work. There's a whole range of ways of going about it, right? And some of that is understanding the church as a hub with a number of resources that can connect all of the different efforts. So one way to ask that is even in your church members of how have your partner work in these community ministries? What have you learned? What relationships do you have? How can another one partner to do that? So here's an example. A woman in West Marva who's a school teacher talks about sitting and working at school and realizing that the kids that were going home had no food from the time they left school at 3:00 in the afternoon until they came back at 8:00 the next morning for breakfast. And so she worked both with the school system, her congregation, and just brought them together to build a food pantry within their school building. They just called it the food closet. And so that pulled on a number of resources that were already there to address a particular need. And she could do that partly because of both being a teacher and a part-time pastor, right? That the church could bring those pieces together in a way that the others couldn't.
Hey, Josh,
Yeah, go ahead.
Craig Coble again. I
Mhm.
really like the scripture that you started out with. And I think one of the things that E-Town is particularly good about is not only helping people to regenerate, but also to do things to preserve community spirit where it's already good. And I
Mm.
think in some ways, both of those can be equally important. Any
Mhm.
thoughts on your part?
Mhm. I think in Brethren culture, not just E-Town, what I heard you say is that kind of like recuperate. Is that the word you used? Recover.
Or
That
recover or regenerate.
regenerate, right? Yeah, thanks. Um, because Church of the Brethren members are so engaged in or aware of the needs of their community and world, that church has been a place where we go into to restore, to regenerate. The language I hear often is get our batteries recharged, right? To be able to go back out and do those things that we do, whether that's in our community service, but also in terms of our workaday life, right? Our vocational jobs. I think that's a super amazing valid, and I think churches can be that restoring place. I think even right now in the midst of COVID, how churches can be a place to remind people of mental health, caring for ourselves, that kind of stuff. I think that's spot on. I think the other thing is exactly what you just said, is that we can also be a place that names community as a central part, right? That it's not just work and go home, work and go home, work and go home, but that it's relationship building together inside the church, but also outside of the church, how we connect around to our neighborhoods and say, hey, I know so-and-so, do you know them? And building a fabric of community in our neighborhoods, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I'll just say that in our church, I see a lot of people who do things in the community to prevent degeneration,
Mm-hmm.
so you don't have to get to the regeneration step. And I appreciate that as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, folks, we got about 10 more minutes left in our time. We like to wrap things up about 10 after. What other questions might we have for Josh this morning?
Josh, this is Julianne Keith,
Mm-hmm.
member of the congregation. How do you define neighborhood? Does it have to do with geography or relationships or both? For example, our congregation has developed relationships with and financially supports the church in Nigeria. Is that included in something like the welfare of the city?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Roy Winter and I were just talking about this after the Compelling Vision came out, that neighborhood is often not, is a concept that applies differently, right? So as we think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, the question is, who is my neighbor? And Jesus starts with a story primarily of relationship or broken relationship too, right? He doesn't say geographically, okay, your neighbor is the person who lives within a 5-mile radius. And it's one of the things that I think that you'll hear us as staff begin to do is layer that meaning of neighborhood in ways that says, okay, let's get beyond geographic. Let's think about neighborhood or being a neighbor as relational. And in some cases, I think in doing that, we want to name two things. One is there are significant international relationships that we have as congregations in the Church of the Brethren, right? That neighbor means global. How are we a global neighbor? How are we a denominational neighbor to our sisters and brothers? And yet there's also to say your neighborhood, what's the need right outside your door, right? And neighborhood could also mean getting out of the kind of racial and economic stratifications of our communities, right? So how do you build relationships with the people in the neighborhood that you often don't go to because of certain things, right? And that those things are possible as well. So it's expanding out that idea and layering it in a way. You were asking, someone just asked in the chat to me about how are we going to get those podcasts. There is a page on the Church of the Brethren. It's brethren.org/podcasts. And we'll push those out through Newsline when those drop as well, that you can see when they're coming, or that they'll roll out and be available. There's also Church of the brethren.org/webcasts and webinars. And so you can go there and see recorded versions of webinars we've already done, and also see the upcoming ones if there are things that you want to touch into. The last one that we just did was called Brethren Distinctives in Church Planting. I think it'll be an interesting one for many of you to check out as well.
Josh?
Yeah, go ahead.
Had a question. The image that I saw in the City of Refuge was a person at the engine of a car, and in that garage that they worked. And my question is, how does the hands-on kind of facilitating where you're with people in assisting them in having something of value where they learn a skill? And that's been a part of the Brethren too, kind of sharing that with people. Just teaching people how to put a seed in the ground. Would you comment on that and how that fits into?
Sure, it's a great one. I think that's part of the development side of things, right? Is giving. It's the old adage. I mean, it's almost pithy at this point to say, right? Like you don't just hand them a fish, you teach them to fish, right?
Yes.
And I think that's true. And I think we've done that in a number of our international settings. The question that I would press back to us is in the national churches, okay, how are we teaching skill sets like that? I think a number of folks, I think of my own grandfather who has been amazingly active in Habitat for Humanity. I don't even know how he does it at 80 years old as a site supervisor now, but he loved just as much when the classes of vocational tech students would come to build houses during the week, where he could teach them skill sets as they grew. I think we can begin to think about some of those in a whole variety of ways. I think that partnership at City of Refuge with Napa is so striking in that regard, right? That we can also think about how we partner with what might typically be called for-profit organizations that want to grow capacities in their communities, that have the resources. Napa drops, for every one of those graduates that come out of there, they get a whole new toolbox, literally a toolbox full of brand new tools for whatever job site that they go to next, right? That they're just excited to be able to offer that and support the training that happens at City of Refuge.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I see one there. Yeah, go ahead. I see you waving.
Thank you. That was a very interesting, presentation you've given this morning. If you were talking to a church that wanted to get involved in some sort of local development activity, do you have a basic checklist of the questions they really need to ask themselves in terms of are we able to realistically do this? Do we have the people? Do we have the resources? Do we have the money? Are we in there for the long haul? Can you just give us a basic idea of the questions that you should ask yourself?
I think the first question, and really is the question, is are you open to where it's going to take you? Right. I think Bruce is a great example for me, like the openness, right? That openness to say, yes, I can actually help you, is the biggest question that's there. And then the question is, are you willing to be there for the long haul? I mean, this is, this kind of ministry and engagement and mission is at least 2 to 3 years down the road, right? The quote unquote return on investment doesn't show up until 5-6 years of engagement. Coach Gordon out here in Chicago says that when he was doing community development stuff in Lawndale, which is on the west side, that really they didn't see huge measurable results until 10 years out, right? I think the resources question is one that you can always answer even in the midst, right? You can find partners who will support it, and how do you craft your mission there? But I think it's those long-term questions of capacity, willingness, and staying power. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I'm super glad to take this opportunity and join you guys. I mean, given the way everybody's talking about air travel right now, I'm just glad to not get on an airplane, but that I can still come out and hang out with you all for a little bit. Thanks for taking the time, and Jason for pulling it together and inviting. Glad to join you. Good to see all your faces. I'm glad to see so many folks and some names that I know. Joe, good to see you. And glad you're healthy. Looks like so many folks. Thanks for letting me into your homes too, those of you who've got cameras on.
Well, Josh, thank you. Thank you for making the time an hour earlier in your time zone than us. I appreciate that. And may we all think a little bit about this, the ways in which we are connected to our communities, and the ways in which we can continue to find our own path and our own light and our way to be supportive of people around us. I've been inspired by so many people within this congregation, some people on this call, and the ways in which I've seen firsthand how people have contributed positively. And there's always more to do, right? There's always different ways that we can think about that and how that changes over time. Josh, I was reminded of the last 3 lines from the compelling vision kind of opening piece, which is that about creating disciples that are for innovative, adaptive, and fearless. And that's the time we're in right now. I mean, I don't know what 3 words speak better to doing ministry in this immediate sense, but for us to think about that, in the long term, innovative, adaptive, and fearless. And so I would encourage you to think about how we can continue to do those things. But Josh, thank you for being with us. Everybody, I hope you hope I see you in the chat in the live stream soon. But blessings to you all. Take care. I'll be ending this session, so see ya. Thanks.